Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Maddison and Dave Sharrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here again. And today I'm with my good friend Dave and my good friend Steve. So, Steve, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Very pleased to be here. My name's Steve Pereira, also from Toronto, along with Peter, and I run a very tiny consulting company called Visible Flow Consulting. And what we focus on is improving operational performance in large companies, specifically focused on areas like continuous delivery and large scale collaboration. So anything from release process to continuous integration and continuous delivery, platform implementation, reorganization, all that stuff. I love to talk about it. I love to do it. And that's what I focus most of my time on.
With that in mind, where do we begin?
It's a lot. There's a lot we could talk about. I think there's a lot we have in common for sure.
Yeah. So, Steve, maybe just to kind of kick a conversation off, what is the most common pain point your clients are coming to you about? Because, as you said, we all sort of work sort of overlapping spaces, and I think we just see different kinds of headaches that
Mhm.
our different clients come to.
That's a good one. That's a good place to start. I think that the most common thread, if I were to summarize it, would be organizations that feel like they're capable of much more, right? There's a sense that they have very strong capabilities, very strong staff, very smart people, very capable people, and more than enough of them. And yet the outcomes, even the output that they see, doesn't match their expectations. It could be something that they hear about from competition. It could be something that they hear about from a totally different industry, that gets them interested in what's possible
Mm.
if they were able to change their environment somehow. That could be, in my case, it's often, you would think that folks come to me because I spend a lot of time doing value stream mapping to eliminate waste and reduce costs and kind of drive standardization and a lot of kind of lean Six Sigma behaviors, but it's almost never a topic of conversation. They often come with a desire to just untether their staff,
Right.
just allow their staff to kind of perform at the level that they know that they can, but that bureaucracy is holding them back, process, legacy technology, organization is kind of constraining them.
Yeah.
So it's surprising to me, actually. I honestly thought when I started doing this work that it would be all about cost cutting, but it's more often than not about the upside and what's
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah. I'm really impressed, Steve, how you've described everything that you look for, or your clients are looking for and where they're coming from without saying the word efficiency once.
Yeah.
Because I think this is the bit that you're kind of walking around, which is so many organizations go, we have all these people. Why can't we get things out of the door? We need to be more efficient. And that mindset is not the one you described. You described
Mm.
it about how can we untether the latent potential in the organization. We've got the right people, we've got the right kind of things in place, we know what we should be doing, but somehow we're holding them back, which I think is just it's a mindset that we look for. Yes, of course, we look for that sort of mindset because it's a very different conversation than once you do the value stream mapping and you start looking at where the hurdles are, where the bottlenecks are, becomes a very different one.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
the
think that.
balance, right? It's either am I going to use this capacity to grow or am I going to use this capacity to shrink? So, like, I can do less with more or more with less.
Right. And, I would expect that it would be much more seasonal. I would expect more conversations
Yeah.
about efficiency and cost cutting in leaner times, in more challenging circumstances when, capital cycles are tightening or when the market is particularly volatile or
Mhm.
something that would typically motivate that. I don't know if there's an evolution of the conversation. I'm sure there is. I think there's a lot more sophistication from the buyers of that equation, the buy side. I know that, personally, it's not something I've ever really talked about. So if folks look me up, they
Yeah.
know I don't talk about
Right.
cutting headcount and
Yeah.
what's possible if you just, get rid of all the people who aren't performing. Like, I spend a lot of time talking about the system of, and not individuals within that system, but how that system enables individuals to perform. So it could be a little bit of both, but honestly, I'm a little surprised that there's not more conversation about efficiency.
Mhm.
It could also be that I spend a lot of time at larger scale than individual developers or individual contributors, particularly at the team and above. So there might be less conversation at that level around individual performance, where you start to see a lot of efficiency talk, but I don't know what it is about that.
Yeah.
I would hope that the conversation is evolving.
I love the idea that it is evolving and that the buy side is really getting past that focus on cost cutting, headcount reduction, and things associated with that, because the latent potential that is there is so much more upside than any sort of, we kind of all know is efficiency becomes this grind that you keep trying and keep trying. And of course, what you end up doing is losing the heart of what's really going on and losing resilience. You're not able to respond so much. You become more brittle as an organization.
Yeah, you remove all of the slack, which means that you end up with no ability to be flexible when something you're not expecting turns up, and you suddenly no, well, all those people that you had over there that were there to be able to respond, well, they're gone. So
Right.
that's not
I think this is actually a common criticism of lean tools like value stream mapping, is that they encourage a path of wringing all the slack out of the system, or trimming everything that would allow for serendipity and innovation.
Yeah.
And I've always believed the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
And so I get into a lot of heated discussions with folks who, I can tell that that's the angle that they're coming
Yeah.
from, and try to kind of engage with them on this opposite perspective.
Yeah.
That there's so much upside to take the waste, the friction, and transform it into space and freedom and
Yeah.
supports
Yeah.
that allow us to turn the dials up on creativity
Yeah.
and human ingenuity, which is an interesting angle about AI that we could get into, but
Yeah.
probably talk
Well,
a
yeah,
lot about that
exactly. It kind
anyways.
of dries, it just goes into almost the opposite direction to the one you're describing. Because as you were describing that, I'm thinking of the engagement that you tend to get as well. Because when you give people the space, clarity about where they're going, you remove those bureaucratic, frustrating things that trip you up, that don't allow you to kind of seize an idea and run with it, then that whole, the energy goes up and ideas kind of flow through. And we've not talked about flow. Flow is a big part of what you're describing. And I was just thinking in my head, nobody ever says the word flow and efficiency at the same time. The two are, there's flow is much more about I'm not going to call it an art form, but it's more about the intangible aspects of how work gets done than efficiency, which feels to me a little bit more, only the tangibles. And it's somebody somewhere has a clock ticking away, a stopwatch ticking away, is the feeling you get with an efficiency conversation.
Right. Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts. But I see the same thing,
Yeah.
that flow has retained this positive
Yeah.
association in people's minds, that at a personal level, at a collective level, there's kind of pleasant analogies that come to mind when you think about flow. And I hope that doesn't go away, because I
Yeah.
think that is something that's a huge benefit to us, to have a frame of reference that we can kind of illustrate our ideas and not be associated with
Yeah.
cost cutting, efficiency, ruthless, operational excellence
Yeah.
associations.
Yeah.
I think that there's much more to be gained from an abundance framing than a scarcity framing.
Well, the origins of value stream mapping and out of the lean space were largely around, well, how do I optimize for this system of building very like parts out of a factory, so that versus knowledge work where, and because things are so unknown, we need that space. We need the space to explore. We need that space to think about how things are going to work to create flow in the system. Because if we don't have it, then things won't be able to flow. They'll hit roadblocks all of the time because we don't have the capacity to flex or to change as the direction we need to go in changes. So there's this difference in where that came from, which and I know Steve, and when we both worked with manufacturing companies, and their perspective of value stream mapping is somewhat different because their view of it and what they call value stream mapping is it comes from a very different space. It is all about the time diagnostic of the system and how do I make every single part of the system operate most efficiently.
Yeah, there's still a lot of challenge there. I spent recently a lot of time in the lean space with a lot of manufacturing companies, a lot of physical logistics companies, distributors, and they, I think, really struggle to kind of port their lean knowledge or their lean frame of mind to knowledge work and to invisible because it is fundamentally different in many ways. I don't think it's fundamentally different in every way.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge to try to describe the fact that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a baby in there, right? Like I spend a lot of time talking about that there's so much value in value stream mapping applied to knowledge work, despite the fact that it's not a perfect fit. That it's not exactly the same as a manufacturing context. I haven't found anything that's a better fit. So that's like my number one. But, you do have to do a little bit of unlearning and relearn to apply it and have people kind of nod their heads and say, okay, I understand that we're not aiming to print out the exact same outcome every single time.
Yeah.
And yet we do follow the same process every time. Like we put one foot in front of the other all the time, and we aim to not run in circles. So there is a flow. There's a flow that we can visualize. There's a flow that we can measure. There's a flow that we can optimize, and we can use it to enable more creativity, more innovation, more slack in the system where we want it.
When you're describing that, Steve, the interesting thing I think is that optimization is driven by things like collaboration, by conversations, rather than, and I was just thinking of dependencies and managing dependencies in a sort of manufacturing setting. That managing of dependencies is contractual. It's space in the manufacturing factory floor and where things are, so that when you need them, there are no gaps there. It's very different in a creative space because you don't know when that dependency necessarily will occur. It doesn't have to be right at the beginning. It can be somewhere in the middle of some sort of digital production that you might be going through. So the dependencies are much more emergent, I think, in that digital space, which means you need not these sort of rules-based ways of handling management, dependency management, which of course so many organizations feel really comfortable with that. If I define a process and here's a bunch of steps and this is what we need to do, that feels like that problem will go away now. When actually we know in that creative space, that's almost any time you try to constrain like that, you actually generate peculiar behaviors that are holding you back somewhere else that you didn't realize.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting all of the ways that constraint can be kind of referenced and manifest itself in this context. I do think that if I'm using an artistic context, well, if we start from a manufacturing context, what we really want in a factory floor, and the reason we have these contracts and we have this like strict adherence to this pile of materials is to sit in exactly this place, and it's marked out and we keep track of exactly how much is there so that nothing gets interrupted. And then you have that goes all the way back to the suppliers and the supply chain that make sure it's there when it needs to be there. And then if you take the opposite end of the spectrum, a pure craft like woodworking or painting, the woodworker, the painter, they still only deal in mediums that they specialize in, that they have experience in, that are kind of domain aligned or customer aligned, even if they're,
Mm.
if they're a little bit commercially minded, they have, these constraints around what am I going to need to do my job at any given moment, right? And I make sure that's stocked. I make sure it's available. I might even label it,
Yeah.
So that exists in the physical world across that spectrum of
Yeah.
maximum creativity and
Yeah.
adaptation all the way to, maximum efficiency and predictability and stability. But then in the knowledge work space, I see the same patterns in very high performing organizations. They have those contracts for the dependencies that are absolutely mission critical, right? I mean, there is a chain that runs from a product all the way down to its like baseline infrastructure that if anything fails or anything isn't available or easily leveraged, everything grinds to a halt or quality suffers or you have some detrimental impact. So we do see contracts in place in even those circumstances, but we do see slack in other places. There's an incredible ability to leverage the exact same tooling in the mission critical systems
Yeah.
for a side project or an experiment. But I think that what we aim for in both circumstances is if I need something to produce a valuable outcome, I can get it without having to hunt for it, without having to ask for it, without having to wait for it. And I think that really is something that emerges out of value stream mapping very clearly. How do we get to the outcome we're trying to get to? If we trace it backwards to how we got there, these dependencies, the requirements, the lack of contract or the contracts that aren't serving us, the missing pieces where someone would ideally be able to just reach for what they need and get it, to pull that on demand, that becomes very obvious. And I think that's really powerful because aside from that, you have these environments where it's just part of daily business, that it's not available. I might as well start something else because I'm going to have
Yeah.
to put that on hold. All
Absolutely.
these
Yeah,
negative conditions we see.
for sure.
You end up running lots of things in parallel, and we all know what that does. So all these
Yeah.
unfinished pieces of work that clutter up the mind.
One of the things that, and maybe afterwards, if you guys have a good one, you could send it to me. But I recently just drew up a simple illustration of what happens when you have a contributor that hits friction, right? In the flow of work, they hit this friction point, they just pick up another work item, right?
Yeah.
They're like put
Mhm.
something on hold, say it's
Yeah.
blocked, start the next thing. And you just have this accumulation of work in progress as a result of,
Yeah.
The natural ability for people who want to be
Yeah.
productive, useful, see progress.
It's the utilization problem. You very quickly find that, well, actually now I'm working on far too many things and now nothing's getting done because my mind's so fractured across many different areas that everything starts to grind to a halt. And when the really critical thing comes on, I'm busy doing all of those other things and I can't take that on too. So I've got
Yeah.
and those
Right.
types of problems.
And it's funny in a lot of organizations or contexts where they talk about efficiency, utilization is
Yeah.
usually part of the conversation where it's the opposite, right?
Yeah.
It's the opposite of efficiency.
Yeah, I was using a graph last week for a presentation where it was there's this assumption that if we start at 0% utilization, it's 100% cost, and that 100% utilization with at 0% cost, because that means that we're getting the maximum amount of value we possibly can out of the person. But that doesn't take into account all of the friction that occurs as we start to get closer to 100% utilization, because once you get closer to 100% utilization, there's all of the handoffs. We're waiting on everybody to wait for everything to happen. I've got to put this down to start this next thing, which means I'm context switching. And it's very nice to be able to, if you draw these two graphs across each other, of course, you see that, well, actual optimal utilization is more around like 80%. We can show that you don't want to fully occupy all of the capacity in the system because it'll just grind to a halt.
Right. And I think, it's fair to say we want to keep that capacity to prevent 100% utilization. But I think it's even better to say that we're budgeting that and we're going to spend it intentionally and say that, in cases where we have capacity and we run into a situation where we need to use part of that capacity, we know where to use it appropriately. It doesn't get spent in
Yeah.
lower value areas, or it doesn't get spent in something that isn't ultimately going to lead to better outcomes. So it's great to have that capacity, but we also have to kind of design the use of that the same way that we
Yeah.
budget finances.
Yeah.
I think you're touching on prioritization there now. So, what is the
Well,
next most valuable thing that you could work on?
this
Right.
it's the visibility into how to make those decisions, because what goes with that is great when you have capacity and you look around where, if you do pick something up because you have that additional slack, or what do you pick up and how does that align with what the organization needs you to do? And this is again now where, do we need a role who runs around managing that, or do we have some sort of visible practice that allows it to be obvious what the next piece is there? Again, in manufacturing, there's another vehicle or product coming down the line. You don't have to overthink that one too much in certain contexts, but in other contexts, like you described about painting and woodwork, well, you can go start lots of different things. I mean, who knows what the next thing should be becomes a part of that problem to
Yeah,
understand.
and we're definitely in that, closer to that realm in the world of software, right?
Yeah.
Where every work item should be unique and an improvement on the last. That has a lot of implications. But
Yeah.
I think that, the much the same way that you don't want 100% utilization, I don't think you also can't really have 100% certainty on priority,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and it can't be one person's responsibility, or even one team. I think you need slack there as well for people to use their own judgment and say, yeah, I know this is top of the backlog,
Yeah.
but based on a conversation I had 20 minutes ago, I think we have to rethink this, right? I'm not just going to pull the next thing off the line. And I think that visibility, a strong sense of value, and a knowledge of customer is like so critical for that. So we don't end up sort of just blindly
Yeah.
following the plan as it's been shepherded through the system in its current state. But
Speaking of which,
that's very difficult.
speaking of which, AI.
So before we dive into that, I just wanted to, as you were describing that, Steve, I'm just thinking of the Hippocratic Oath and medical practitioners,
Mm,
where they, in some context, they have this, they have to make decisions about priorities, where to spend their time. And what's interesting there, rather than a rule book, they've got, first of all, this concept of a Hippocratic Oath, that the sort of, do no harm, or do the best you can for people in need. And I must admit, I don't know exactly the wording of the Hippocratic Oath, but it's something along those lines.
right.
But coupled with a whole bunch of decision-making criteria, so they're able to make rapid trade-offs in very, very challenging environments. And what I find around digital work, but software delivery as an example, is we don't spend the time to understand that our sort of responsibility, our principles about what we're delivering. You just mentioned always wanting to leave the product stronger, better, and a better piece of software, but that's not everywhere. There's a lot of places that will go, no, we just need to be good enough in this area, rather than always leave something better than we found it. And also, we don't put those practices to make rapid decision making much easier. And so there's actually so much ambiguity in how you would make a prioritization decision, or Peter would, or I would, in many digital spaces, which you don't see in some of these other, admittedly, much more kind of consequential domains. But there's more effort gone into how do we make decision making clearer, and how do we deal with ambiguous decision making in a
Mhm.
way that doesn't carry with it blame, like, Dave, why did you pick that up? Well, you really needed you. It's somehow obvious you should have picked this other thing up.
That is where it gets very interesting and challenging in most organizations, because I think that the way that they tend to approach this is heavy upfront planning to try not to make the wrong decision about prioritization and sequencing and direction. And it's a very high touch, very intensive analysis of what should we do, based on all of our obligations, all the criteria. And so it's like tight, loose, tight, right? So
Yeah.
tight initial definition,
Yeah.
very loose in the middle, get it done, meet your obligations, make sure it's done by the deadline. And then it often tightens up again with
Yeah.
multiple review cycles, right? We're going to test with this group, then a totally different group will test. Then we go through, this group and that group, and we make sure that nothing bad gets out the door.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to balance that out. And I like tight, loose, tight when I have no time to deal with anything, and I really just have to kind of set something
Yeah.
and hope for the best, and then make sure that by the time it's done, it's okay. I don't think it's a viable system of work. I think a viable system of work is closer to what you get in a manufacturing context where the assumption is we're going to be doing these activities for a long time.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing all of this stuff as long as the market will let us, and we'll do it bigger and better, but it's not going to go away. So we'll invest in all of these baseline capabilities, things like triage, things like an andon cord where if you run into trouble, you send a signal immediately. And there's all kinds of procedures behind that people get used to. Things like A3 problem solving to iron out, the wrinkles in the system. And so there's much more kind of ability for continuous decision making, but also there's more decisions placed on the system of work
Mhm.
than on each individual work item. And that's partially by nature of how manufacturing works. But I think we could stand to have a great deal more of that.
Yeah.
And I think the highest performing organizations have a great deal more of that within the continuous
Yeah.
flow of work, within the system of work.
They have well-defined systems for making decisions, essentially. So, in a lot of what you were just describing, there are those mechanisms that people at like Andan Courts, Triage, J3, these are ways of helping make the decisions in the moment, and teams have those capabilities at their disposal to be able to do that. But to your point, Dave, that's not uncommon for organizations not to spend enough time thinking about how that's going to be done here.
Yep.
That what do we do to make decisions? How do we make decisions? If we disagree, how do we disagree? How do we move forward? And things like that.
Yeah, I think some of those systems, they can be difficult to understand what is the right amount of structure there, like what is the right amount of definition. And clearly, it took the lean context, the lean world of manufacturing, a very long time to kind of settle on standard tools or somewhat standard tools. But I think we do have, quite a bit at our disposal. One of the interesting things to bring us back to AI and tie in value stream mapping was the latest Dora report, the state of AI driven software development. They spent a considerable portion of the report talking about value stream management, and they were basically talking about value stream mapping, but value stream management being the continuous practice of managing flow. And I think it was, obviously I'm very pleased to see more attention on value stream mapping, but the angle that they were presenting it under, I think, was very much in this vein of saying, in order to leverage AI, in order to leverage advanced capabilities, in order to know where to implement these solutions, and this goes for any type of technology, right? I mean, it was less acute when it was cloud, and even functions as a service was getting closer to that, but that was a long time ago. But it's very easy to waste a lot more money with AI. It's very easy to implement it in places where it will actually make things worse. This actually happened with functions as a service also, but
Yeah.
to a lesser extent, there was way less attention. But I think that the narrative there was spend some time on this system of work. Understand the system of work, understand how to measure it, understand what it looks like, how it actually functions, so that you can focus some of your attention on things that are holding you back from other things you want to do. Like we can spend a lot of time developing new products and features with AI, but if we can't get things done today,
Yeah.
or if we're liable to waste a lot of time and money, or even that we're liable to make the wrong decision, then it serves us to understand the system of work as it is today, redesign it, clean it up before we start adding in a bunch more complication.
Yeah, so otherwise things can go a little wrong if you start injecting non-deterministic systems into what should be deterministic processes. And we've seen some of the problems with that. And there's certainly enough noise around, well, maybe that's why systems start to fail more often now. Is it a correlation or a consequence or just pure coincidence that we start to see more failures in production?
And it kind of cuts both ways because it's easier to find and diagnose problems in a lot of cases. Like AI can be an incredible assistant to diagnose failures and issues. But it's also in many ways, poorly understood when it,
Yeah,
fixes something and we say, oh, great, now I can move on to
yeah,
something else. But we didn't actually pay attention to what it did and make sure that that's not causing some other problem somewhere
yeah.
else. It's a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah, I have
And
a lot of fun stories around that.
and I'm sure many more will be coming out as well. I just maybe just as we're sort of heading towards a close, but one quick question I had is you talked about standardizing work and standardized processes that really comes out of that lean mindset, and how long it took to get there. One of the things that I've certainly seen more times than I care to remember in software delivery and product delivery in that sort of digital space is this holding on to the creative nature of it, that
Mm.
loose piece. So, standardized work, which is such a critical element of taking out things which are repetitive and standardizing them, which in a digital space, you'd think there's so much room for that automation, that standardization of it. And yet, it is not a priority. In fact, it's almost challenging the identity of many of the those involved in that creative space by trying to standardize something they view as creative. And that creates this gap where we're not really building up these standardized practices. I mean, DevOps movement really turned that on its head a little bit, but I still see in program delivery, like programmers struggle with that automation, standardized work elements of what they do in many areas, not everywhere, but in many areas.
Yeah, and I think that it's a challenge to find the middle way there,
Yeah.
certainly, because the practices are evolving and they are so flexible. Like it's very natural to say, why constrain this when it doesn't have to be constrained? It can be this spiral of infinite recursion where we try a little thing and put it out and see what happens, and we kind of go with whatever feels good. And I think that where we really hit friction is when process is a very manual, onerous obligation for people.
Yeah.
And it's not something that gets instrumented into code and automation as quickly as possible. Like it's very difficult to be in a position where you don't like the way something works and it's mandated now and this is standard practice now, and that means that we're not going to look at it for a long time. Like that's kind of, I think, the individual contributor fear, that we standardize something, it gets baked in and nobody's going to talk about it for another 9 months, so I'm signing myself up for whatever this process is to be that way for the foreseeable future. And
Yeah.
these things, they do end up calcifying very quickly. We think of software and technology as very dynamic, but processes really don't change
Yeah.
until there's some kind of catalyst.
Mhm.
And it's another reason I like value stream mapping as, a way for us to kind of force that
Yeah.
evaluation of, first of all, it doesn't have to be this way. Do we
Yeah.
want it to be this way? And how would we redesign it if we were to better serve our goals, which have probably changed dramatically since the last time we looked at this. So I think there's a very natural reaction
Mhm.
to standardization when it becomes process and governance that doesn't, again, bring that tool or that resource directly to people so that they can just access it without thinking or without going to somebody else. Like that's the kind of standardization I think people don't, they don't want to have to go jump through hoops, fill out paperwork, fill out a form. They do want to be able to just write their code, commit it, and have everything just fall into place.
And that works every time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is so difficult to do, right? I mean, it is truly challenging. And I think that's why we'll be in business for the foreseeable future. This work is very, very difficult to do.
Very true.
With that note, it's probably about time we wrapped up. And I think it's a good note to end on. So at this point in the conversation, we do like to bring 3 points for our audience to take away from the conversation. And since there's 3 of us, we get 1 each. And as our guest, Steve, I'm going to let you go first. So what would you like our audience to take away from this conversation?
Thanks. Well, I'm glad I'm not on the hook for all 3.
Oh, that's a great idea.
I'm such a big fan of kind of stepping away from the work and looking at how the work works. How is the system of work performing today? I've never found that not pay off. So I would encourage folks to, however they want to do it, even if it's with a conversation or reflection, step away from the work to find out not only is the saw dull, but are you sawing the right tree, right?
Yeah.
Like these things, it's so easy for us to get caught up in the day-to-day or be distracted by everything that is emerging. And neither of those circumstances is conducive to like designing a better system of work. So I think kind of intentional distance to observe and reflect and act is really powerful.
I like it. Yeah. Dave?
I'm one of the things, and there's quite a few, we've touched on a wide range of topics that really resonate. But the phrase I'm going to walk away with is the tight, loose, tight observation. And because as you're saying that, I'm literally was just thinking about a number of organizations where that pretty much exactly describes. And they're often, by the way, different departments, of course, as well. But that tight, loose, tight, there's this feeling of control without it actually generating predictable delivery that comes with that. So that's something for me really to take away to the idea of, less loose, but also less tight as you sort of look at various aspects. Again, taking a step back, looking at that system of work. Normally at this point, Peter's like frowning because we've taken all the low-hanging fruit for the feedback.
So
I'm actually I'm going to leave our audience with something to go and read, because you were touching on and we touched on triage and some concepts around that. There's a book by, I believe Eliot's daughter, basically called Concepts of Flow, I think. And that one has one of the concepts she brings into that when looking at prioritization of work coming into the system is she talks in detail about things like triage and other mechanisms to be able to think about prioritization of work that's coming into the system. That's quite a good read, and there's some good takeaways from it. So
I love that book, actually. I think it's called Tools of Flow, but I also might be mistaken.
Flow concepts or something. I will include it in the description.
Yeah. The one thing that
oh, you got a
totally, I know, totally disallowed, but and it pertains to tight, loose, tight. It's
other than the t-shirts we have that say that.
Hopefully there are t-shirts that fit that way. That would be challenging. But it was the first time that I felt like I really truly understood full kit, the concept of full kit.
Yes,
just enabling someone to do all their work uninterrupted from beginning to end of a task. That was very, very powerful for me, and I've remembered that ever since. So it's a great book for lots of gems like that.
Yeah. Same here. Yes, I've taken that idea from there and used it on many occasions. It's awesome. Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's a fun conversation as always, and thank you, Dave, as always. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you to you both. And until next time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks, Peter.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Maddison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.